Okay, so today something rather interesting came up in my writing, which is this difference in perspective between the writing mindset and the editing mindset. And at first glance, these might seem to be two things that are pretty much synonymous, but I find that in my writing, they are dramatically different from one another. And this came up at my writing group, or rather my read aloud group, where we sit and we actually read chapters and we kind of critique each other's work. It's a really wonderful, beneficial thing. And if you don't have something like that, I would strongly encourage you to look into it at some point. Maybe once you have enough stuff to really sink your teeth into. But something rather interesting came up today as we were going through a little bit of my writing. I had this scene where, it's the second chapter. The characters have kind of gotten out of the little town that they were in. They're starting to make their way across a desert. And mostly I'm just kind of playing with like the mundane pieces of life. Like, what is life like in this fantasy world? And so I have a pretty decently sized chapter. And in this chapter, they're starting to, wake up after the night's journey and making coffee and making breakfast and these kinds of things. And as I was reading this aloud, I was thinking to myself, like, there's a lot of content here. Like, there's a lot of, the grinding of the beans, retrieving the beans, what that smell smells like, and these kinds of things. And when I was writing it, I was mostly just exploring the mundanity of life. I like those kinds of things in stories. I like knowing that the characters I'm reading about are real people who experience things that are similar to me. And so the writing portion of myself puts those things down and has a lot of fun playing with them. But reading it aloud, going back and editing it in preparation for this group, and then even some of the feedback that I got was fairly intriguing. And so this brought me to this difference between those two mindsets. That when you approach building your world or writing your novel, whatever kind it is, that the writing mindset and the editing mindset are two fundamentally different things. For example, when I talk to people about their writing in the same way I talk about their artwork, I will often encourage them to just write everything. Keep yourself writing. Like if you're exploring a scene in a castle and you want to take, 2 or 3 pages and explore what all the tapestries look like, what all the corridors look like, go ahead and do that. While you're in the zone, while you're enjoying it, just kind of keep playing with things. Have fun with it. But there's a fundamental difference when you come back to edit something. Because when you edit something, you're looking at the purpose. And if you try to do that in the beginning, when you're going through and you're writing things initially, it can create these really big hiccups. So I think maybe one of the most beneficial things here is to try to keep those two mindsets separate. Maybe there's a little bit of tension because you want to be swift about how you're putting together your work. You want to get your book done quickly. But I think the reality is that if you approach writing far more like a painter than a typical writer, you might be in a beneficial place. And what do I mean by that? Well, I was an art teacher for 11 years in the public schools, and I find that painters often don't feel like they care much about making sure that first layer looks good. A drawer, a writer will sit down and they will try to make sure that those first couple words or lines really communicate what they need to. But a painter knows they're going to cover everything up in like 20 minutes. Even if you're working with oil paint, this is usually the case. And if you're working with watercolor, you're going to be doing a really thin layer to begin with, and you're going to build up on top of that. So if you approach your writing like that, where the first draft of a thing is just to get a first layer, to get your thoughts out there, and then continue to build up on top of things, I think you're going to put yourself in a far more beneficial place. When I go through and write a chapter, I kind of just keep going and expanding. If I want the fight to go longer, I let it. If I want the description to be really thorough, I let it be thorough. And then when I come back to edit, I can take apart each of those components. I can make sure that they fit, that they are accomplishing something. And I think that's really where it comes down to. What is the purpose of that segment? And so writing me needed to write out that coffee scene and that breakfast scene, but editing me is looking at it and trying to figure out what does this communicate about my characters, my world, and how does this push the plot forward? I don't necessarily think everything needs to push the plot forward. You can certainly have things that are just intriguing, but it's got to be interesting. So I got some pretty awesome, solid advice from the other people in my read aloud group, which kind of came down to this. The point of having that scene with the coffee, if it's making coffee in the same way we make here in our world, is pointless. But if it's made in a process that tells us something about that world, if it's made in a way that tells us something about that character, if another character can chime in and talk about how they make coffee in the weird region where they come from, you get something that's a lot more intriguing and is unique to your story. And this is what that editing mindset allows you to do. You come back through and you start pulling things apart, analyzing those individual elements and going, what purpose does this serve in my story? And so as I pull that apart moving forward, I've got some really cool ideas about what I might be able to do. And it's difficult. It's always hard to go back through and pull things apart. But I think that if you can separate these two mindsets, approach the writing like a painter, where you are going through and you are just putting down whatever you want so that you have it to work with and to sculpt out later. And then you take your editing mindset and you let that be much more like an engineer, where you're coming in and you're seeking efficiency. And sometimes that efficiency is just going to be to make a character more intriguing, to make the world more vast. Those are purposes. But if I'm including that coffee making process just because it's what I wrote, I don't need to hold it so dear. I can let that go. And I can make space for things that are going to be a little bit more interesting. So that's all I have for you today. Just some thoughts based on my group and the lovely individuals there. The takeaway, I guess, is just try to keep these as two different mindsets if you haven't already been doing that, and see how that works in your processes. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Good luck with your writing and world building. I'll see you soon.